At my son's engagement dinner, his fiancée slid my wedding ideas off the table. Too old, out of style. Her mother smirked, her friends laughed, and my son said nothing. I folded my notes, smiled, and stayed silent. Months later, when their $55,000 dream wedding planner vanished with every dollar, my silence became my revenge. I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from. The memory of that afternoon still lives inside me as vividly as the steam rising from the cup of tea I brewed, steady and familiar in the quiet kitchen. The light of early April poured through the windows, soft and golden, catching on the polished counter I had wiped clean minutes earlier out of nothing but habit. At 61, I had learned to cling to the rituals that made the passing of time bearable. The same mug, the same brand of tea, the same 3-minute steep. It was a rhythm I could trust, even as life had taught me that nothing else remained constant. Daniel sat across from me at the table, his fingers drumming lightly against his phone, his foot tapping beneath the chair. I thought it was nothing more than distraction, the way grown children always seem tethered to their screens. I didn't know that in the next breath, the very ground beneath my life would shift. He looked up suddenly, his eyes carrying both pride and nerves, and said, "Mom, I proposed." Madison said yes. The words hung in the air, suspended, glittering. For a moment, the kitchen itself seemed to pause, as if even the sunlight wanted to hear them more clearly. My chest filled with an ache so deep it almost frightened me, not of sorrow but of joy. My son, my only child, was getting married. A dream I had tucked away in silence, one I had barely allowed myself to imagine, now stood before me like a gift wrapped in gold. I smiled so wide it hurt. "That's wonderful, Daniel. Oh, honey, I'm so happy for you both." My hands trembled as I placed the spoon on its saucer, already envisioning the aisle, the flowers, the music, the look on his face when he saw his bride walking toward him. After decades of being just mom and then just Evelyn the widow, here was my chance to step back into the world I had once commanded. I had built weddings for 3.5 decades, planned everything from rustic barns tucked in Vermont hillsides to glittering galas beneath Boston chandeliers. People in those circles had known my name, trusted my vision. But this would be different. This one was ours. The wedding of my only son. The day I had carried in my heart through every lonely night since his father passed. "I already have some ideas," I said, almost laughing at the rush of excitement. "Not to interfere, of course, it's your day, but I'd love to help, just a little. I still have my book of contacts, florists, photographers, venues." That was when I saw it. The hesitation flickered across his eyes like a shadow passing through sunlight. Daniel looked away. He cleared his throat before speaking. "Actually, Madison kind of already has a vision. She's really into this modern minimalist stuff. She follows a planner online, someone she might hire." The words landed like stones in my chest. For a beat, I blinked, my smile frozen. "Oh, I see, but it's a family event, isn't it? I thought maybe I could just be part of a few decisions. Not all of it, just enough to feel—" I stopped myself before the ache cracked my voice. That was when he said it. The sentence that would echo through everything that followed, carving lines where once there had been none. "She thinks it would be best if you just stayed in your lane." The air rushed out of me. For 5 long seconds, I couldn't move. I smiled too hard, the kind of smile that stretches across your face like a mask, brittle and false. I repeated his words softly, almost as if to test whether I had misheard. "Stay in my lane," hoping he might laugh, shake his head, admit it was nothing more than Madison's clumsy phrasing, but he only nodded, his voice calm, practiced. "It'll be smoother that way. You know how she is. She just wants to avoid confusion." Smooth. Avoid confusion. I had spent 35 years smoothing chaos into elegance, turning confusion into harmony. Now suddenly I was being told I no longer belonged, that my hands, my knowledge, my heart were liabilities in the very place I had once been indispensable. I excused myself minutes later, murmuring something about a call with an old colleague. There was no call. I sat on the edge of my bed in the growing dusk, lights off, staring at the fading sky as silence pressed in. For decades, I had poured myself into the weddings of other people's children, shaping dreams into reality, watching mothers cry with joy as their sons took vows. And now, when my moment finally came, I was told to stand aside, told to stay in a lane that led nowhere. I didn't cry, not that night. I lay still as if my body were memorizing how rejection felt when it came from your own child. I whispered to myself that it was a misunderstanding, that perhaps Madison hadn't meant it, that Daniel was only trying to keep the peace, but deep inside something had cracked, a shift subtle and irreversible. I didn't know then how invisible I was about to become. I only knew that for the first time in years, I felt the sharp edge of being unneeded. The weeks that followed blurred into fragments of polite conversations and shallow phone calls, as if my son were fulfilling some quiet obligation rather than reaching for me the way he once had. Daniel's voice carried less warmth with every exchange, his words clipped, efficient, as though we were business partners arranging schedules rather than a mother and son holding onto a bond. Madison never called, not once. Her absence was its own declaration, a statement as sharp as any insult spoken aloud. I told myself it was the whirlwind of engagement, that planning consumed them both. Couples grew distracted, short-tempered under the weight of decisions. Perhaps Madison, proud and modern, wanted to prove her independence. I tried to be patient, to believe I still had a place in their unfolding story. But the truth was already there, unspoken, wrapping itself tighter around me each day. I was being pushed out, step by step. The clarity came one Saturday when Madison invited me to what she called a wedding vibe lunch. The message had landed in my phone with the same flat cheer I had grown used to. A group gathering, her mother, some friends, casual conversation about ideas. I clung to the invitation as if it were proof I hadn't been forgotten. I dressed carefully that morning, pulling on a soft peach blouse that brightened my skin, fastening small gold earrings that caught the light. I wanted to look approachable, hopeful. I carried a slim folder with me, filled with ideas I had printed out, timeless floral arrangements, seating plans that encouraged warmth, lighting tricks to make photographs glow. It wasn't a takeover, only a quiet offering, a bridge between what I had lived and what they were building. When I arrived at the cafe, the group was already gathered around a table. Madison barely lifted her gaze from her phone when she mumbled a greeting. Her friends glanced up, nodded politely, and returned to their chatter. Victoria, her mother, offered a smile so tight it might have been painted on. I slid into the empty chair, willing myself not to feel out of place. I ordered tea and waited. The conversation meandered between colors, dresses, flower walls, and Pinterest inspiration boards. My folder felt heavy in my lap, but when the moment came, I placed it gently on the table and opened it with care. "I brought a few things," I said, my voice steady. "Just some ideas if you'd like to look." Madison didn't even glance down. She lifted a hand, her expression casual but dismissive. "That's okay, Evelyn. We're going for a more current look. Nothing too traditional." The word traditional slid from her tongue like it carried dust, like it was something to sweep away. Her friends giggled, leaning in eagerly. "Yeah, everything's on TikTok now," one of them chimed. "There's this planner in LA, she's amazing. She did this whole disco ball thing with the neon palms. It was insane." They bubbled with laughter, excitement spinning among them, their voices climbing over one another as if I weren't even there. Madison added, "We just want something really us, you know? Not the whole ballroom, lace, vintage vibe. That's just not our thing." Her smile landed on me, sweet in shape but hollow in substance, as though her words hadn't just swept away 3 decades of my work. I nodded. "Of course, it's your day." I folded the folder closed and slipped it quietly back into my bag. The paper whispered against my fingers, the sound louder than the chatter around me. A moment later, Victoria leaned toward Madison, her whisper sharp but not soft enough to escape me. "I told you she'd bring something." She probably thought she'd take over. Madison glanced at her quickly, then turned back to me with that same rehearsed smile. "We really appreciate your excitement, Evelyn. Truly, but I already have a vision." Her tone was velvet wrapped around steel. I smiled back, but inside something hollowed out. I had seen brides like Madison before, confident, sure of their taste, blind to wisdom that didn't fit their vision. But I had never imagined my son's future wife would see me not as an ally, not even as family, but as a threat to control. The lunch ended quickly. I hugged no one goodbye, simply gathered my things and walked to my car. I sat in the driver's seat for 20 minutes, hands resting on the steering wheel, radio humming softly. My eyes burned, but no tears fell. I thought about calling Daniel, about telling him how his fiancée had humiliated me in front of her friends, how my work had been reduced to a punchline. But I knew what he would say, that I was overreacting, that Madison didn't mean it, that I was making things harder. So I swallowed it, the way I always had. I drove home, made chamomile tea, changed into the softest pajamas I owned, and turned on an old rerun of The Golden Girls. I let the canned laughter fill the silence of my living room while my heart sat heavy, a stone at the bottom of a lake. Later that night, I stood in front of the mirror, really looked at myself. The fine lines etched at the corners of my eyes, the silver threading through my hair, the curve of my shoulders still carrying more strength than I often remembered. I whispered to my reflection, barely believing the words even as I spoke them. "You deserve better than this." It was quiet, almost nothing, but deep down I knew it was a vow, one that would grow roots in the weeks to come, reshaping everything I thought I knew about loyalty, love, and the place I held in my son's life. There comes a moment when silence no longer protects you. It doesn't shield you, doesn't keep the peace. It simply buries you. I felt it in the days after that humiliating lunch, a weight pressing down until I could hardly breathe. I wanted desperately to believe that Madison's dismissiveness was nothing more than nerves, that Daniel would eventually notice the lines being drawn around me. But each call I placed went unanswered. Each text returned with curt words or emojis that said nothing at all. I was already vanishing from their picture, and the world they were building had no space for me. So I did what mothers have done for centuries. I tried again. I invited them to dinner, determined to remind my son of who I was, of what family was supposed to feel like. I polished the silver, ironed linen napkins, set candles along the table until the dining room glowed. I slow-cooked a pot roast the way Daniel had loved as a boy, the kind that filled the house with warmth and memory. I even baked an apple cinnamon pie from scratch, the scent rising through the rooms like an old song. I wanted the evening to feel safe, familiar, to remind them that home was not a trend or an aesthetic, but a place built with love. They arrived half an hour late. Madison stepped through the door, her face twisting almost instantly. "Oh, wow," she said, wrinkling her nose. "The smell is intense. I don't really eat red meat." Her words cut before we had even sat down. Daniel offered me a sheepish shrug, one I had seen too many times before, the expression of a boy caught between two worlds. We gathered around the table. The food I had poured myself into sat untouched, the roast barely carved, the pie waiting patiently in the kitchen. I tried to keep the conversation alive, asking about venues, colors, what kind of dress Madison imagined. Her answers were short, clipped. When I mentioned a seamstress I knew, one who still designed custom gowns with the kind of craftsmanship Instagram couldn't replicate, Madison set her teacup down with a sharp clink. "Evelyn," she said, her voice calm but carrying the edge of finality, "I know you mean well, but I just feel like you're not hearing us. This isn't the 90s. We don't want a traditional wedding. I already have someone in mind to plan everything. She's incredible. She just did this eco-themed elopement in the desert, and it was breathtaking." Her eyes gleamed as she spoke, but not once did they meet mine. Daniel stayed quiet, his silence ringing louder than any words. I nodded slowly, steadying my hands, even as my heart split wide open. "Well," I said softly, "I hope it's everything you want it to be." Madison smiled. "It will be. I have a very clear vision, and I just want everyone to stay in their lane so it all goes smoothly." The phrase struck again, sharper now, no longer a suggestion, but a command. Stay in your lane, words that built walls higher than any I had known. I cleared the dishes in silence. I packed leftovers into a box and pressed it into Daniel's hands at the door. I kissed his cheek, inhaling the faint scent of cologne that still reminded me of his father, and then I let them go. When the door closed, I stood in the quiet glow of candlelight, staring at the empty chairs. I thought of every wedding I had orchestrated, every family who had wept with joy, every bride who had clung to me in gratitude. And now my own son's fiancée had reduced me to a nuisance, a relic, a shadow to be managed. In that moment I knew I wasn't part of this story, not in the way I had dreamed, not in the way I had earned. Madison hadn't invited me to share their life. She had tolerated me only long enough to draw the boundaries. And Daniel, my Daniel, had let it happen. Fine, I thought. If they wanted me out, I would honor their wish. I would stay in my lane. But lanes have destinations, and the road I would take when I did would not lead back to them with open hands. What they didn't realize was that exclusion has a quote-down. When you erase someone, when you silence the love that built you, you don't get to claim the reward of their devotion. You can't cash in on the very thing you have thrown away. I blew out the candles, one by one, watching the smoke curl upward like ghosts disappearing into the air. I wasn't crying anymore. Something inside me had hardened, transformed. This was no longer about one dinner, one slight, or even one wedding. This was about my worth. And for the first time in years, I felt the faint stirrings of power rising where shame had tried to root. If you've ever been pushed aside by the people you love most, you know this truth. Silence isn't weakness. Sometimes silence is the first step toward strength. And if you want to know how that strength carried me into choices I could never take back, stay with me, like, share, subscribe, because this story is only just beginning. The dinner had left me hollow, but it also stripped away any illusions I had left. I could no longer pretend that I was simply misinterpreting Madison's tone or Daniel's silence. They had drawn their circle, and I was outside it. Still, a small part of me kept reaching, aching for a thread to hold on to. That was why when Madison invited me to dinner at her parents' home, I accepted. I told myself it might be an olive branch, a chance to rebuild what was breaking. In truth, I was testing the last fragile edge of my hope. Their house was elegant in a way that felt cold, as if warmth had been carefully edited out. Every surface gleamed, every corner carried gray-tone symmetry, like a magazine spread rather than a family home. Not a single picture hung on the walls. No fingerprints on the glow, no clutter in the corners. A house that looked lived in only for the performance of it. Madison greeted me with the same smile she always wore, flawless and impenetrable. Her mother, Victoria, met me with a wineglass in hand, her tone syrupy and practiced. "Well, Evelyn," she said, her lips stretching into a polite crescent, "Madison tells us you used to do wedding planning. That must have been interesting." Interesting, as though 35 years of weaving dreams, balancing budgets, calming brides, and perfecting details had been no more significant than a hobby. I answered softly, "Yes, for over 3 decades, I loved it. Helped many people create memories that lasted." Her smile tightened. "Well, thank goodness for Instagram now. So much easier these days, isn't it?" The words slid across the table like a knife. Daniel sat beside Madison, his gaze lowered, offering me nothing. I forced another smile, though my heart clenched in my chest. Dinner was served, salads arranged like artwork, portions too delicate to satisfy. The conversation revolved around guest lists, palettes, catering options, and features Madison had discovered online. At one point, she described a tunnel of LED vines that pulsed with music, something she envisioned as the reception entrance. I nodded gently, offering a note of caution about overwhelming guests with too much stimulation. Before I could finish, Madison cut me off, her tone sharpened by her ever-present smile. "I know, Evelyn. That's why I'm working with someone young, someone current." Silence followed. The sting spread hot across my cheeks, but I swallowed it, lifting my fork with steady hands. I would not give them the satisfaction of watching me break. Later, Victoria brought out photo albums, her own, filled with Madison's childhood, birthday parties, vacations, dances. Madison cooed over each page, while Daniel offered polite nods. I had come prepared too, carrying a small envelope with pictures of Daniel as a child. His first Halloween, the wobbly triumph of his first bike ride, the wide, toothless grin when he lost his front teeth. I thought perhaps those snapshots might be welcome, a glimpse of the Baron who was now Madison's future. I handed them over. "Maybe a few of these could go into the slideshow," I said gently. "They're very special to me." Madison glanced at them for a second, then shrugged. Oh, they're cute, but we kind of want the vibe to be more stylized. These are very, real. Real, as though reality itself were a flaw. I wanted to scream. This is your fiancé's childhood. This is the man you claim to love, messy and joyful and imperfect. This is what love looks like. But I did not scream. I slid the photos back into the envelope, tucked them into my bag, and pressed my lips into a smile that tasted like ash. When the evening ended, Victoria hugged me with one arm, her wine glass clinking in the other. Madison waved from the kitchen as though she were signing off a video call. Daniel walked me to the door, his silence heavy, his shoulders sagging with the weight of keeping the peace. I'm sorry if tonight felt awkward, he whispered once we stepped outside. I looked at him, really looked. His face carried exhaustion not from work, but from the strain of standing still between two storms. I'm not upset, I said softly. But Daniel, do you even see what's happening? He rubbed the back of his neck. She's just under pressure. Her mom, the planner, social media, everyone has expectations. I just want things to go smoothly. At what cost? My voice was quieter now. What are you sacrificing so things can go smoothly? He said nothing. His silence was its own answer. I kissed his cheek, inhaled the fading scent of childhood still clinging somewhere beneath the cologne, and walked away. That night, back in the solitude of my kitchen, I opened the drawer where I kept the wedding fund. 20 years of careful saving, sacrifice, pennies and dollars tucked away for this day. My late husband's handwriting filled the little notebook beside it. The words simple but weighted. For Daniel's day. Make it count. I stared at it for a long time, the ache in my chest swelling until it nearly broke me. Then, with a steady hand, I drew a line. I took the account, left only a symbolic amount behind, and transferred the rest into a savings account under my name. It wasn't an act of cruelty. It wasn't revenge. It was the quiet drawing of a boundary long overdue. The next morning, I slipped a short note into an envelope, along with a modest check. Dear Daniel and Madison, as you prepare for your big day, I wanted to offer a small contribution. I trust you'll make it meaningful in your own way. With love always, Mom. I sealed it, mailed it, and let the silence speak where my voice no longer could. Betrayal rarely arrives like thunder. It doesn't crash in with sound and fury. It slips in quietly, wearing the voice of someone you love. That was how it felt when Daniel showed up at my door, his face lined with tension, carrying the weight of Madison's disappointment like it was his own. He didn't waste time. We sat down in the living room and he refused the tea I offered, his hands twisted together, restless. Mom, he said. Madison saw the check. She was surprised. I nodded calmly. I imagined she would be. She thought, well, we both thought you'd planned to cover more. Maybe the whole thing. I met his eyes. I changed my mind. The silence that followed stretched until it cut. His jaw worked, like he was chewing words he couldn't swallow. Why? Because I wasn't invited to be part of anything, I said gently. Not the venue, not the decisions, not the vision. I was told to stay in my lane, so I did. He flinched as if the words had landed like stones. It's not like that. Madison she likes control. She gets overwhelmed. She's trying to make everything perfect. Perfect doesn't mean excluding the people who love you, I said softly. And overwhelmed isn't an excuse for disrespect. He looked down. My son, the boy I had raised, now a man who could not bear the truth staring back at him. Finally, he muttered, she feels like you don't support her. I raised an eyebrow. Does she feel that way because I brought photos of your childhood? Because I suggested a seamstress? Because I wanted to help? His silence was answer enough. Daniel, I continued, my voice steady, you let it happen. You stood there while I was erased. Pain flickered in his eyes. That's not fair. No, I whispered. It's simply true. The air between us thickened. He stood abruptly, rubbing the back of his neck the way he had since he was a boy. So that's it? You're not going to help at all? I did help, I said, in the way I was invited to. He exhaled heavily. Madison's going to freak out. I didn't comfort him. I didn't soothe him. For once, I let his discomfort belong to him. Not long after I learned the full truth, Madison had already signed a contract with the planner she idolized online. Savannah Bloom, 2 million followers, a curated feed, a name whispered like a goddess in heels. Madison had rushed into a $55,000 contract without secured funds, without due diligence, without a single thought for reality. I could barely process it. You gave someone you have never met that kind of money? Based only on videos and posts? She's legit, Daniel insisted. His voice was brittle, already fraying. Testimonials, pictures. She only takes a few clients a year. We had to move fast. Is she licensed? I asked, a pause. Does she even have a registered business? An office, references? Madison handled it. I felt sick. The story unfolded in my mind before he even finished. The blind trust, the desperate scramble to impress, the illusion of exclusivity. I had seen mistakes like this before. Only this time it was my son standing on the tracks, bracing for the impact. I didn't scream. I didn't argue. I had already chosen my lane, and it no longer involved saving them from choices they made without me. But a mother's heart cannot fully detach, no matter how deep the wound. Watching him march into disaster with Madison pulling the strings made me ache with a helplessness I had never known. Still, I stayed silent. Weeks passed. I filled my days with small rituals, walks in the park, lunches with friends, books stacked high on the nightstand. Outwardly, my life steadied, but inwardly, I carried the heavy certainty of what was to come. The collision was inevitable, and then the call came. Daniel's voice cracked through the phone, hoarse and frantic. She's gone. My breath caught. What do you mean? Savannah. She took the money. The website's gone. Her number's disconnected. The Instagram's wiped. We've been scammed, huh? Every penny is gone. I sank slowly onto the garden bench, roses trembling in the wind around me. What do we do? He asked, his voice breaking. What does Madison say? She's not talking to me. She's blaming me. A pause thick with shame. She said it wouldn't have happened if I'd convinced you to give the money. The words sliced clean through me. Not just because they were cruel, but because they revealed the truth I had feared. My love, my savings, my worth had never been valued as gifts, only as guarantees. That's not true, I said firmly. This happened because you both acted as though my money and my experience were owed to you, like they were yours by right. He was quiet, and in that silence I heard the shattering of his illusions. I wish I could tell you that moment brought me triumph, but it didn't. I didn't feel victory. I felt the hollow ache of watching everything I had foreseen come to pass. Madison's obsession, Daniel's silence, the erasure of my worth, all of it converging into collapse. And yet, in that same moment, I felt something else stirring. A strange, steady strength that whispered, you were right to draw the line. You were right to stay in your lane. Because sometimes staying quiet isn't surrender. Sometimes it's survival. If you've ever watched someone you love ignore every warning, only to fall into the very trap you tried to save them from, you know this truth. Silence can be louder than any revenge. And if you want to know how their choices unraveled everything they thought was unshakable, stay with me. Like, share, subscribe. Because the storm had only just begun. The collapse came faster than even I had imagined. One decision unraveled everything. The money vanished, the planner disappeared, and Madison's dream dissolved in a storm of blame and bitterness. Daniel called me again, his voice unsteady, stripped of its usual composure. It's all gone, Mom. Every vendor canceled, deposits lost, the wedding... His voice cracked. The wedding is off. I sat very still, the phone pressed against my ear. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Not because I mourned the canceled celebration, but because of the quiet devastation threaded through his words. What about Madison? I asked. He gave a bitter laugh, though it held no humor. She says it's my fault, that I should have pushed harder, convinced you to pay for everything. She says I ruined it. I closed my eyes. The irony was sharp on my tongue. This isn't your fault for not convincing me. This happened because You let yourselves believe you didn't need guidance, only money. You trusted illusions instead of experience. Silence stretched across the line. For the first time, I heard him breathing like a boy again, lost, frightened, standing at the edge of something he didn't know how to face. In the weeks that followed, the engagement unraveled completely. What began as disappointment curdled into resentment, and resentment into finality. Madison moved out, retreating back to her mother's immaculate house. The story they offered to acquaintances was that the wedding had been postponed, but everyone knew the truth. Their world, curated for perfection, had collapsed under the weight of its own vanity. I didn't gloat. I didn't whisper "I told you so" to anyone. I did the only thing left to do. I stayed quiet. I stayed in my lane as they had commanded, and from there I watched the fallout scatter like ashes. There is a peculiar kind of grief that comes when you lose something you never truly had. That was what filled my nights then. I had never been invited into their union. Not really. I'd been tolerated at its edges, silenced when my presence didn't fit the picture. So when it ended, what I mourned wasn't the wedding itself, but the hope that I might have belonged in it. The days stretched into a strange rhythm. I checked my phone more often than I wanted to admit, half expecting a text, an apology, even a single word. But the screen stayed blank, silent, as though I had been erased entirely from their story. To keep from drowning in the silence, I threw myself into small, steady acts. Morning walks to the market, the sound of vendors calling out produce prices like music in the open air. Afternoon coffee on the porch, where I let the sun warm my skin until I could almost believe in gentleness again. Evenings spent with books I hadn't touched in years, their spines cracking open like old friends who had waited too long. I repainted the hallway in sage green, soft and calming. I cleaned closets still heavy with my husband's things, sifting through shirts that smelled faintly of him, belts worn at the edges from years of use, boxes of tools that had gathered dust but not memory. Piece by piece, I lightened the weight that had pressed on me for too long. It wasn't joy, not yet, but it was peace. Some days the ache returned, sharp and insistent. I would think of Madison's dismissive smile, of Victoria's patronizing tone, of Daniel's silence when I needed him most. The words "stay in your lane" echoed like a curse, and yet, even then, I felt a strange clarity. I had chosen boundaries over bitterness. I had chosen dignity over desperation. News traveled in whispers through neighbors and friends. Madison was telling people Daniel had ruined the wedding. Others said the cracks had already been there long before Savannah Bloom took the money, that Madison's hunger for control had grown unbearable, that Daniel had begun to question her long before the scam forced their hands. I listened, but I didn't respond. I no longer needed the gossip to validate what I had seen with my own eyes. Their engagement had never been built on love. It had been built on spectacle, on the image of perfection, on the performance of romance rather than the substance of it. And when the stage fell, there was nothing left to hold them together. One evening I sat in my living room, the lights dim, a book open but unread on my lap. I stared at the unlit fireplace and thought about all the roles I had played in my life. The fixer, the planner, the mother dear, and the widow. I had bent myself into shapes to fit other people's expectations, believing that if I did it well enough, love would hold me steady. But now, in the quiet aftermath, I saw the truth. Love doesn't ask you to disappear. Real love lets you stand as you are. Daniel didn't call again, not for a long while. And though the absence stung, I made peace with it. I stopped waiting for recognition, for apologies that might never come. Instead, I filled my days with living, with the small, ordinary joys that no one could take from me. The wedding that never was had already given me something I hadn't expected, the chance to remember myself. Revenge doesn't always arrive with fire. Sometimes it comes dressed as silence, waiting patiently, while the truth reveals itself. That was what I discovered in the months after Madison walked away, and Daniel was left standing alone in the ruins of what had once been called an engagement. At first, the quiet hurt. I checked my phone too often, the screen lighting up with everything but his name. I told myself not to hope, not to wait, but love has a way of clinging to habit. My house felt too large, my evenings too long, and in the empty spaces, I faced the ache of being forgotten. But time has its own kind of mercy. Slowly, I stopped holding my breath. I stopped arranging myself in the shadows of other people's choices. But I filled the hours with pieces of a life I had neglected. I joined a garden tour with an old friend. I sat in a ceramics class shaping lopsided bowls that made me laugh harder than I had in years. I hosted a small Sunday brunch for women from the library board, filling my table not with expectation, but with companionship. The strangest part was the way lightness returned quietly, like a guest knocking instead of barging in. For the first time, I wasn't chasing approval. I wasn't bending to fit anyone's vision. I was simply Evelyn again, widow, mother, woman, whole in ways I had almost forgotten. And then the news broke. I saw her face on the television one morning, framed by the slick polish of a news segment. Savannah Bloom, the planner Madison had idolized, the one they had entrusted with $55,000. Her photo glowed with filters and curated elegance. Beneath it, the headline ran in bold letters: "Social media wedding planner vanishes with hundreds of thousands in client deposits." Couples appeared on the screen, weeping, their dreams gutted. A father spoke of taking out a second mortgage, another couple of canceling their honeymoon. The devastation stretched across the country, and among the names listed as victims, Daniel Carter and Madison Clark. Victims. The word sat bitter in my mouth. Yes, they had been defrauded, and yes, I would never wish such loss on my son. But beneath the headline lay the truth no reporter could see. They had also been victims of their own pride, their hunger for spectacle, their refusal to listen. I didn't cheer, I didn't gloat. I sat at my kitchen table, sipping coffee, letting the numbness settle. This wasn't triumph, it was tragedy, a preventable one. Madison moved back to her mother's house. Her curated fairy tale collapsed into silence. Daniel stayed in his apartment, shoulders heavy, eyes hollow when I finally saw him from a distance. He didn't call, not then, but I knew the day would come. You don't lose everything and fail to look back at what was real. When he did return, it was not with fanfare, but with a quiet knock at my gate. He looked thinner, older, not in years, but in the way loss etches itself into the lines of a face. "Hi, Mom," he said, and the word landed in me like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. I let him in. We didn't speak of Madison right away. We talked of smaller things: his work, the book on his nightstand, a podcast he had discovered. I let him fill the silence until the weight between us thinned. Only then did he whisper her name. "Her name's Emily," he said. His eyes softened in a way I hadn't seen in months. "She's different, kind. She listens." He hesitated, then added, "She asked about you." The first time I told her about my past, she didn't ask about the wedding. She asked about you, said she wanted to meet the woman who raised me. I felt something stir deep inside me, a cautious, fragile hope. "She doesn't need to prove anything," he continued. "She doesn't want control, she just wants something good." That was when I knew the storm had passed, and in its wake stood the possibility of something new. Not perfection, not spectacle, but real. If you've ever been erased, if you've ever been told to stay in your lane, know this: the road you take in silence may just lead you back to the love you thought was lost. Stay with me, because what came next was not just another wedding. It was the moment I finally found my way home. Like, share, subscribe, and don't look away now. The best part of the story is still to come. Emily entered my life like a quiet dawn, soft and steady, without demand. The first time I met her, Daniel brought her over on a Sunday afternoon. She carried a basket of fresh bread she had baked herself, wrapped carefully in linen. When she handed it to me, she smiled. Not the rehearsed kind, not polished for performance, but warm, unguarded. "It's just something I like to do," she said shyly when I thanked her. "My grandmother taught me. She always said bread should taste like love." That was how she was, every word, every gesture grounded in something real. We sat together in the living room, the three of us, sunlight spilling through the curtains. Daniel leaned back in his chair, more relaxed than I had seen him in years, while Emily asked about my garden, my favorite books, even the story of how I met his father. She listened, truly listened, her eyes never darting to a phone, her face never folding into impatience. When she laughed, it wasn't delicate or restrained, it filled the room. And when she spoke of her own family, modest, tight-knit, built on long dinners and simple celebrations, I recognized the foundation immediately. It was the kind of love that didn't need spectacle to prove itself. After that afternoon, they came often, sometimes for dinner, sometimes for tea, sometimes just to sit on the porch while the evening settled around us. Emily always helped in the kitchen, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. She asked me to show her how to prepare the pot roast Daniel had loved as a boy, and together we chopped, stirred, and laughed over the details. Daniel says this was his favorite meal growing up, she said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. I think traditions like this matter. They make a house feel like home. I glanced at my son then, saw the quiet gratitude in his eyes, and felt something shift inside me. It wasn't just relief, it was healing. The day Daniel told me he planned to propose, he did so with a gentleness that pierced me. We were walking through the park, leaves scattering beneath our steps. He cleared his throat, glanced at me with a boyish nervousness I hadn't seen in years, and said, I don't want to make the same mistakes again. This time, I want it to be about love, not about show. Tears filled my eyes before I could answer. When he slipped the ring onto Emily's finger a week later, there was no audience, no stage photographs, just the two of them, a bottle of champagne and a simple promise whispered in the quiet of their apartment. They told me afterward, their faces glowing, and I hugged them both so tightly I felt my heart stretch wide enough to carry us all. Planning the wedding was nothing like the chaos I had endured before. Emily wanted something small, intimate, wrapped in meaning rather than glitter. She asked for my advice, not because she couldn't decide on her own, but because she valued what I had to give. Would you help me choose flowers? She asked one evening, leaning across the kitchen table. I know you've seen more weddings than anyone, but I want something that feels like us. Her words undid me. All the years I had carried experience that felt like baggage, dismissed as outdated, were suddenly lifted into light again. Together we walked through markets, smelling roses, tulips, and lilies until we settled on a mix of ivory and blush peonies, soft, romantic, unpretentious. The day of the ceremony, the air hummed with warmth. Guests gathered in a small chapel draped in natural light, the wooden pews polished, the air scented with flowers we had chosen together. Emily's gown was simple satin, elegant in its restraint, and Daniel's eyes shone brighter than I had ever seen. When the music began, I felt my chest tighten. I thought of the wedding that never was, the case, the pain, the exclusion. And then I looked at this moment, small, tender, real, and I knew that every wound had led us here. During the reception, Emily's father stood to give a toast. His voice shook as he spoke of his daughter's kindness, of Daniel's steady heart, of the way love had brought two families together. Then unexpectedly, Emily turned to me. I'd like Evelyn to say a few words, she said. I froze. For a heartbeat, I couldn't move. And then Daniel's hand squeezed mine, grounding me. I stood, my voice trembling, but strong enough to carry. Love isn't measured in chandeliers or flower walls, I said softly. It's measured in the way you hold each other through storms, in the laughter that lingers when the music ends, in the ordinary days you build side by side. Today, watching you both, I see love in its purest form. And I couldn't be prouder. Applause filled the room, but it was Emily's smile, wet with tears, that seared itself into my memory. That night, as I helped gather the last of the flowers, I felt the deep, quiet peace of something restored. Not the peace of forgetting, but the peace of survival, the kind that comes after weathering a storm and finding yourself still standing. The weeks after Daniel and Emily's wedding unfolded like the soft turning of pages in a book I had waited my whole life to read. Their love was steady, quiet, rooted in something deeper than appearances. It was not a performance to be photographed and paraded. It was a life they were building day by day, and I was finally invited to be part of it. They visited often, sometimes with bread still warm from Emily's oven, sometimes just to sit with me on the porch while cicadas sang in the summer dusk. Daniel fixed the loose step on my staircase, Emily helped me prune roses in the garden, and together we filled the air with laughter. Ordinary moments, unpolished, imperfect, and yet they shimmered brighter than any spectacle Madison had once envisioned. One evening after dinner, Emily gathered the dishes with me in the kitchen when she set a plate in the sink, then turned to me with eyes soft and certain. You know, she said, I think the reason Daniel loves me the way he does is because of you. You raised him to be steady, patient, kind, and I just wanted to say thank you for him and for welcoming me. I couldn't speak for a moment. My throat tightened, my hands trembling with the weight of her words. Gratitude, spoken so plainly, had become rare in my life, and here it was, handed to me without condition. Later that night, I sat alone in the quiet, staring at the photo on my mantel. My husband holding Daniel as a child, both of them laughing into the camera. For years, I had believed my worth was something fragile, something others could erase with dismissive smiles and cruel commands. But now I understood. Worth doesn't vanish because others fail to see it. It lives, steady and unshaken, waiting for us to claim it again. Madison had once told me to stay in my lane. At the time, it had felt like exile, like a prison of silence. But now I saw that lane differently. It hadn't been confinement. It had been a path. A road that led me through heartbreak, through the storm of betrayal, and back to the people and the love that were real. I thought of the canceled wedding, the money stolen, the emptiness that had followed. For a long time, those memories had felt like scars I would carry forever. But sitting there in the dim light, listening to the faint echo of Emily's laughter drifting down the hall, I realized they were no longer scars. They were lessons. Proof that even in loss, something truer could be born. And so I chose to let go, not to forget, because forgetting is a kind of dishonor, but to release the bitterness that once weighed me down. Madison and Victoria belonged to a world of surfaces, and that world had collapsed without me needing to lift a hand. I didn't need revenge. My survival, my peace, my joy, that was victory enough. Months later, when Emily called to share that she was expecting, her voice trembling with excitement, I felt tears spill down my cheeks. The story had turned again, and this time it was toward new life, new beginnings. I would be a grandmother, not in the shadow of exclusion, but in the light of belonging. As I pressed the phone to my ear, hearing Daniel's laughter mingle with hers, I whispered a quiet promise to myself. This time, I will stand fully in the circle. This time, I will not be silenced. This time, I will love without erasing myself. Because that is what survival teaches you. That love is not about shrinking to fit someone else's frame. It is about standing whole, seen, and unashamed. If you've carried scars from being overlooked, if you've been told to stay in your lane, let this be your reminder. Your worth does not vanish because someone else fails to see it. And if my story has spoken to you, don't turn away now. Share it. Carry it forward. Let others know they are not alone. Like this, share it, subscribe, and remember, silence is not the end. Sometimes silence is the beginning of your strongest voice.